Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good night, depending on where are you located. It's a great honor for me to be one of the lecturers, and it's a great opportunity to give you a lecture today. The title of the lecture today is Contribution to Peaceful Reunification, the Necessary UN Mechanisms and Youth Participation. In fact, this title was given to me by PSCORE, and I liked it immediately because I have thought about this issue for quite a long time. How the UN can do its role for Korean peaceful unification, and also I always believed that the young participation of young people in the process of the reunification is extremely important. So in that sense, it's a great opportunity to share some of my thoughts in this matter with you today. The contents, I'd like to begin with the concept of global governance. I don't know how you understand the concept of global governance. Maybe there are various definitions of global governance, but I've been studying this issue for the last 20 years, and I have my own definition. I just want to tell you what I think about what the global government should be in coming years. Then secondly, the importance of human rights. In the new form of global governance, in new era, the human rights supposed to be the very most important element in the system of global governance. So I want to explain that. Then thirdly, I'll speak about the UN mechanisms. Probably most of you have a very good knowledge about the UN system, but I'll just go over briefly. Then I will go into the North Korea and how we have to handle the extremely difficult the issue that is the peace and human rights development issues in North Korea. Then I will share some of my thoughts about the future. First, the global governance. I wrote a book about 16 years ago. The title of the book was The International Organizations, the Politics of Global Governance. That's 2004, and fundamental question of the book was what is going to be the role of United Nations in the global governance? Whether or not UN can be a core of global governance in 21st century. It's amazing 20 years already have passed since the beginning of 21st century. And the answer to that question was actually, it depends on how we deal with the UN system. There's no clear answer. We know that there are certain limits to the United Nations system. UN is not the world government in any sense. We're living in nation-state system, which is, we respect national sovereignty, and there's no hierarchy in international society. But we know that there are serious challenges to that system. That means we need to create the new form of global governance in responding to the new challenges of 21st century. But we have not created any since I started thinking about this issue. So the question still remains the same, whether or not the UN can be a core of global governance. But there is a certain progress, a certain positive development surrounding the activities of the United Nations. And particularly the more contributions of the civil societies in the work of the United Nations. when you compare what is happening now to what is happening 30 years ago, I have seen the more active participation of civil societies. These days, UN cannot operate properly without the help of participation of the NGOs. So there is a progress, but on the other hand, if you think of the new issues such as climate change and the pandemic issues, now COVID-19 is another case, and digital divide, we have not been very successful. So we still have a long way to go. And the key word, as I've written in my slide, the important elements of global governance are diversity, autonomy, participation, and bottom-up process. I don't know how you could understand this, but basically, even if we're living in nation-state system, we have to understand there are diverse actors, the NGOs, individuals, and other private sectors, etc. They need to autonomously participate in the process of the global governance. I think there is a very important process, and also bottom-up process of norm making is critical now and in the future. So, if you think of global norms that we have now, institutions like IMF, WTO, United Nations, how much do you contribute to creating those institutions and norms of global society? Maybe nothing. The strong state, dominant states, such as United Nations and United States, Great Britain, France, particularly right after the end of Second World War, they all created these institutions. Then sometimes there's a gap between the norms of global institutions and the practices that we're facing. So in order to narrow the gap, in order to create proper institutions and norms, there are more participations of diverse actors are required. So that's the ideal form of global governance in 21st century. And then the question is how the United Nations can help the development of those global governance. So that's in the hands of your the capacity in the future. Okay, then I move on to human rights. I said the peace versus human rights. I often ask questions to students. What do you think of human rights? Unfortunately that I don't have students here, but think about what human rights means to you momentarily. What is the perception of your human rights, and what is the picture or image about human rights? I think you have your own image and pictures. Every student have a different views about human rights. But I have found out that in many cases in developing countries, even in South Korea, the image of human rights are very negative. It is negative, I mean, they think of more, not positive, more depression or some suffering, exploitation, rather than happiness. And also the negative view coming from the understanding of human rights, that human rights is, the concept of human rights came from the Western society. So it is a Western thing. It is not ours. It is not reflecting of our human rights. But it is actually the fact that the concept of human rights developed in Western society, and institutions are also created by the Western people. But it is not to say that human rights is not universal. In every civilization, in fact, there is a respect for human rights. I have another question here. Do you believe that human beings have human dignity? Think about it. I think most of you, all of you, agree that human beings have human dignity. Human beings are human beings because human beings have a human dignity. Human beings are different from animals because we are human beings. So you want to be treated as a human being which has a human dignity. And you have to treat others, other people, as a human beings. That's the human rights. Then we talk about everybody are respected, everybody's dignity are respected, then we'll have a peace. Now, peace and security and human rights have been discussed separately. Let's think about the North Korean case. When we speak about peace and security in Korean Peninsula, we speak about denuclearization or unification. If we unified, North and South are unified, then there's no risk of war, then nuclear weapons disappear, then we consider it peace. But imagine that even if we united, there are more severe violations of human rights. Then do you think it is a peace? So without respect for human rights, peace is not meaningful. So it all depends on how you define the peace. But imagine that we're still divided, and there's a danger of war, but everybody's dignity are respected. Then which is better? So what I want to emphasize is that the human rights should be important concern when we discuss peace and security. Okay, then United Nations. The main goals of UN are peace and development and human rights. When UN was established right after the end of Second World War, actually remember that the victors of Second World War, more than 70 years ago, have created United Nations. We still have a United Nations, but the 5 permanent members of Security Council are victors of the Second World War. That's why the Germany and Japan are not the member of the Security Council permanent member. But when they have created, the most important concern was security. They don't want to have another war like the Second World War. It's devastating. Okay. So they created the Security Council. Then they had to restore the European economy, and also they have to help the development of the third world countries when they became independent since 1945. Then human rights is another important concern for the United Nations, because during the war, Second World War, as you know, there's a Holocaust and there's a lot of violations of human rights. Suffering of human dignity. They wanted to overcome those things. But as you know, the human rights has not been considered as much as the peace issues and development issues. So if you look at the main bodies of the United Nations, I probably wouldn't say those 6 organs in detail. I think you probably know very well about this. The Security Council and Economic Social Council. The Security Council deals with security issues, so peace, and Economic Social Council is dealing with the development. What about human rights? We don't have a Human Rights Council, in the main bodies of the United Nations. Well, actually, even if the human rights were very important concern for United Nations when it was established, the reason why the human rights has not been paid much attention in the beginning is the international structure at that time divided into capitalism and communism. We immediately had the Cold War between United States and USSR, Soviet Union. Then there's an ideological confrontation between two. So security became a more important issue. And there's a little bit of conflict about the concept of human rights between capitalist and communist. So it seems like they postponed the discussion of human rights. So Human Rights Council have not been established until 2006. So by 2006, the UN have created Human Rights Council. Before, obviously, we had a Human Rights Commission under Economic Social Council, but Human Rights Council was established in 2006 under General Assembly. General Assembly is an assembly where all the UN members, 193 members, are participating in. Then they elect members of the Human Rights Council. So 47 members of the Human Rights Council discuss issues of human rights. And then there was a famous Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. And then they have created international covenants. The most important covenants are the covenants of the civil and political rights and covenants on economic, social, and cultural rights. I became the member of the International Committee of Civil and Political Rights. I will serve as a committee member for the next 4 years. But I want to emphasize is that, in the beginning, the original idea was that to have a one covenant dealing with both the civil and political rights and economic, social, cultural rights. But it was divided because of conflict between the communist and the capitalist. Because as you know, the Western society emphasized more of civil and political rights, whereas the communists emphasize more of economic, social, and cultural rights. So even now, the United States is not a member of International Committee of Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and China is not a member of International Committee of Civil and Political Rights. That shows how the human rights are differently perceived by different states. So in the beginning, it was fragmented. And now we have various the conventions and committees, and a lot of activities in Human Rights Council. The politicization of the human rights still a very problem. Okay, then I move on to the international human rights mechanisms. UN mechanisms consist of two bodies, charter-based bodies and treaty-based bodies. Charter-based bodies means the organizations based on the UN charters. So Human Rights Council is the most important, the charter-based body, because it's elected by General Assembly, and the resolutions applies to all 193 states. And second body is the treaty bodies. That is applies to only states who have signed and ratified the treaty. So, as I said, the International Committee on Civil and Political Rights and Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights are the treaty bodies. And China is not a member of Civil and Political Rights Committee, so it is not applied to China. And we have a committee on the right of child and committee on the elimination of all forms of discrimination against women. No, we have 9 treaties So we say these are UN human rights mechanisms. Other than UN mechanisms, we also have regional human rights mechanisms. In Europe, in Africa, and in Americas, we have courts of human rights. Well, we don't have an international court. A court means you can force the states to follow their rules when they make a decision. But in European society, for example, they created a court of human rights, so it's more binding and more enforceable. But as you can see, unfortunately, in Asia Pacific, we don't have that regional mechanisms. I think that's really problematic. That's why we have more problems in terms of the human rights violations. So I've been thinking about this issue for a long time, and the Human Asia that I have established, and now I'm leading that NGO. The final goal of Human Asia is to establish the regional human rights mechanisms in Asia. And then we have civil societies, and we have national human rights committees, commissions. So even if we have a United Nations system, as I said, the global human rights governance cannot be done only by the United Nations. The members of the United Nations are states, basically. The civil societies are not the members. But actually, before I began to work for the United Nations, I had more negative views about United Nations, emphasized more of the limits of the UN. And if you think of negatively, there's nothing much UN can do, because it doesn't have a police, it doesn't have an enforcement power. It just make a statement. Even if they make a resolution, what can they do? North Korea, there are severe violations. UN have done a lot of things to prevent North Korea from violating the human rights, but it seems like there's not much progress. So I was frustrated and I was very negative before I began to work for UN. But I've been working for UN for 6 years, last 6 years, and I will work for the Human Rights Committee for the next 4 years. And I have realized that UN is a very important mechanism, very important organization. And you have to find out how we can better utilize the bodies of UN system. Okay. So again, going back to the original question, whether or not the UN can be the core of the global governance in 21st century, I would say yes, we can do it, but it depends on how we work on it. So in this slide, I talk about the other actors. Other actors need to participate in the process of the law-making, institution building, voluntarily, and bottom-up process is extremely important. And move on to, I just want to quote what Kofi Annan, the Secretary General of the United Nations. The human family will not enjoy development without security, will not enjoy security without development, and will not enjoy either without respect for human rights. This is a really famous statement done by Kofi Annan. Maybe this is a statement that made Kofi Annan very famous. I think it's a really important statement. As I said, in the beginning of the United Nations, since 1945, the three goals, peace, development, human rights, are separated. And they think each issue separately, independently. But now there's tendency to integrate them. So we have created new concepts like human security and right-based approach to development. So we cannot think of global issues without thinking of human rights. So if you had negative views about human rights, You have to change the mind. Human rights for everybody, and it's speaking of human dignity, and basically we looking for the happiness. Everybody living together with respect for the human dignity. So let's go to the North Korean issue. Speaking of peace, development, and human rights, what is happening in North Korea, in Korean Peninsula? We don't have a peace. Nuclears continue to make nuclear threats. And there is a realistically possible war. In terms of development, we know that North Korea is suffering from the underdevelopment. And in terms of human rights, there's severe violations of human rights happening in North Korea. And what we have done, what should we do? Ever since establishment of United Nations, is it fault? Why that's so? Is it all fault of the North Korean regime? Can you say it's all fault of the North Korean regime? The regime is problematic. Regime is gone. Then everything will be resolved. I don't think so. The problem, we all have a responsibility for those problems. It's not, not just the North Korean people or North Korean regime. It's everybody's responsibility. Okay? I here say it's a very important statement. Human rights is core infrastructure for peace and development. Okay? Infrastructure, what the infrastructure mean? Road, airport, plants, those things. Infrastructure. Without infrastructure, you cannot have any the economic activities. Who is providing infrastructure? Infrastructure is provided by the state, right? Infrastructure in global society should be provided by the global people. Maybe UN can do it, but UN cannot work without help of people. So if we didn't provide enough infrastructure for the North Korea to have those institutions, then it's our responsibility. So we have to find out what we can do. Just not just saying that it's a problem of North Korea. But unfortunately, human rights have been means rather than ends in the context of North Korea. Human rights should be ends rather than means, right? Respect for human rights should be the fundamental final goal of our various public efforts. But human rights of North Korea was politicized, and they have different purposes. So that's something I want to explain in the next slide. Basically, policies toward North Korea have been ineffective. Why? I wrote an article, actually many years ago, it's almost 10 years ago, but I think my arguments are still applicable. Why policies handling North Korean human rights have been unsuccessful. It is unsuccessful. It has been unsuccessful because we don't have much improvement in North Korean human rights situation, right? Then I said two theoretical approaches. Well, I just make it simple. Perception-based analysis and implementation-based analysis. Perception, how you perceive the human rights, and implementation, how you implement your policies. Okay. Then perception-based the approaches say that they have a critical attitude toward narrow perception of human rights. Human rights is broad, very comprehensive. There's political, civil and political rights, economic, social, cultural rights. For example, there's a right to the free speech, or right to free assembly, and right to religion, political participation, and there's a right to education, right to health. Now, if you think of what's happening in the COVID-19, the quarantine system, many people are talking about the violation of privacy, this is when they have tracing. But in order to have a collective rights, in order to have guarantee the right to health. Right to health is a very important human right. It's about the human dignity. Without healthy, human cannot be human beings. So there are certain limits to the privacy. So it's very comprehensive. Okay? But if you narrowly focus on particular the human rights policies cannot be effective. Toward North Korean human rights, actually the most states and most NGOs are focused on civil and political rights rather than economic, social, and cultural rights. I know now there are a growing number of NGOs who are paying more attention to second generation rights, economic, social, and cultural rights, but still dominant NGOs and dominant states are emphasizing the civil and political rights. So narrow perception of human rights is the first problem. Then secondly, implementation-based approach, say human rights policies become very inconsistent. Consistency is very important. States are often inconsistent due to the changing national interest and different forms of pressure from a variety of groups. So if you look at what's happening to Korean governments, since 2002-3, when the UN started discussing the issues of North Korean human rights, there are a lot of changes of the regimes in South Korea. So depending on the characteristics of the government, their policies have changed. So it's been very inconsistent. I say it is a politicization. Politicization makes the human rights policies remain very ineffective. So I made a graph here. If you say the perception of human rights, x-axis, and relation with politics, the y-axis, then you can see this. Just think about this slide, this graph. The upper side, right hand, you have more balanced perception of human rights and less politicization. Then we have what I call principled politics of human rights. Okay. And bottom left side, partial recognition, you focus on only civil and political rights, then more politicization. Politicization means politics more than the human rights. So it becomes a means rather than ends. Okay. Then there's a partial politics of human rights. So more activities stay in the left bottom, then policies become inconsistent, ineffective. Okay. So I've done research, and most states and most the NGOs' activities remained the left bottom. Most of them focused on civil and political rights, neglecting the economic, social, cultural rights, and they are more interested in politics rather than human rights. I'll just give you an example. Conservatives in South Korea, they always talk about human rights in North Korea, while they are neglecting the human rights of minorities, refugees, for example, migrant workers. Why? Because they think that North Korean regime, communist regime, is problematic. So they are more interested in elimination of the regime rather than respecting human rights of North Korean people. Conservatives and progressives, lefties, okay, they more emphasize cooperation with North Korea, peaceful coexistence with North Korea, and they are not talking about human rights. Okay. The current government and previous Kim Dae-jung and Roh Moo-hyun government, they did the same thing. when there's a fundamental violations of human rights, which are really problematic about the dignity of North Korean people, then they have to talk about it. I know coexistence and peaceful coexistence is important, but as I said, without respect for human rights, we cannot have a peace. So human rights is the fundamental things for the peace. So in human rights governance, most important concept, obviously human rights are universal, but indivisibility is very important. Indivisible means human rights cannot be separated, okay, one another. You have to look at the human rights comprehensively. You need to have a balanced approach. Sometimes there's a conflict among the human rights values. Okay? As I said, privacy versus security, there is a conflict. But we have to think about this issue. Then we try to get an agreement among people. So I said here universalism versus universalization. People say human rights are universal, meaning that everyone, every human being has human dignity, wherever, whatever, whenever, so wherever, whether you stay in North Korea, you stay in the United States, in South Korea, you are same human beings, and you should be respected. And whenever, the past, now, future, the human beings are same. I had a really difficulty agreeing to this issue because everybody different. You cannot say that the people living in Joseon dynasty in 14th century enjoy the same human rights with the people living in South Korea now. You cannot compare the people living in North Korea with people in the United States. But we're learning that human rights are universal. So what I'm trying to say is, human rights are universal, meaning that we want the human rights being universal. So universalization is very important. You have to put our efforts to universalize the human rights. So without efforts, human rights cannot be universal. So that's why I put universalization here. Then multi-stakeholder collaboration. As I said, the states are primarily responsible for the human rights, but UN cannot do everything. And participation of people, like young people like you, is very important because the perception of human rights is constantly changing. For example, the death penalty. Now the death penalty is disappearing, but still there are some countries like South Korea, United States have a death penalty, but majority of states are abolishing death penalty. But when I was young, I thought death penalty is necessary, but now I'm fighting against the death penalty. So the concept, understanding, perception is changing. A long time ago, we have the slaves. And those who respect human rights recognized the existence of the slaves. But now nobody agrees to it because it hurts human rights. So anyway, if you think there's a problem, then you have to discuss it. You have to share your views, and you have to participate, okay, in lawmaking. That's how we can create the institutions of global governance. And lastly, our future. Because of that, I think the human rights education is extremely important. I respect what the PSCORE has done so far, and that's why I'm here helping them to give you a lecture. And I wish you have a very good, successful model UN organized by PSCORE. And this kind of educations are extremely important, not only just for education yourself, but also the peaceful the creation of international and global governance. And I briefly mentioned about Asian human rights protection mechanisms. The reason why 15 years ago I have established the Human Asia is that I had a little bit of frustration about the North Korean human rights issues. Then I thought that we need to have an infrastructure. Then one of the most important infrastructure will be the Asian human rights protection, regional level human rights protection system. Then the civil society in South Korea can do some roles pursuing that mechanism. So that way we can have solutions to the North Korean human rights. Eventually, that's what I thought. So lastly, I'd like to ask you a question. Where are you from and what is your identity? No, I cannot ask you individually, but think about it. I guess most of you say, I'm from the United States, I'm from South Korea, I'm from Germany, like that. So your identity is depending on where you're born and where you come from. Nobody, I think, will say, I'm from the global society. But for the future, you need to have your identity as a global citizen. And then when everybody has an identity as a global citizen, then maybe easier to create the better global governance institutions. Thank you very much. Okay. Any questions?
So you mentioned that one of the biggest problems on unsuccessful North Korean policies has been that we have a very narrow perception about human rights and that we should integrate more rights on academic, cultural, and economic aspects. So I was wondering how we can set a priority in cases that are very controversial. So for example, recently the South Korean government passed a law on banning leaflet activism in the name of national security. So in these cases, there's like a conflicting. It's very controversial. So how do you set a standard in these cases?
I think it's an extremely difficult question to answer. It seems to me I need to give another hour of lecture to explain that. But what I can say is, in human rights, there's no perfect answer. The reason why I say we need to have a balanced understanding of human rights, and that, as I said, toward North Korea, it is true that most states and NGOs more focused on the civil and political rights rather than economic, social, cultural rights. But now in this government, the Korean government, called the progressive government, they tend to focus more economic, social, cultural rights, and then I wouldn't say they are completely neglecting the civil and political rights. But when you think of, your question was how to prioritize the human rights. You don't have to prioritize the human rights. There's a certain principles of the human rights done by the United Nations. They're all the covenants and universal declarations and resolutions, and there are principles. Then when there is a conflict among the principles of human rights, then we have to discuss it. But for this case in Korea right now, frankly, I don't think the Korean government is doing a very proper job because they are not balanced. But I don't want to go into details of it because of lack of time. But what I want to say is, you need to understand the others' views. Okay, so those NGOs who emphasized the civil and political rights, tend to neglect the importance of other rights. And on the other hand, those who emphasize the peace and security and social rights tend to neglect the civil and political rights. So that's wrong. We cannot say it is just one side, one fault. Okay? Everybody's. So that's why I continue to say the balanced human rights education is very important. Okay? In any the kind of issues, not just North Korea. For example, the responding to the quarantine of this COVID-19 now, there's a lot of debates whether or not the government measures are violating human rights. We need to understand why government have to do it, and on the other hand, the government has to understand why people are arguing against their policies. So again, there's no one clear answer to the human rights, and it's all about our free the discussions, and we have to find out the solution. In coming years, we have more problems of this one because of changing world. Okay? I think a pandemic is one of the important cases. From the perspective of the emphasizing civil and political rights, they do not agree that we have to wear the masks. Okay? We know the Western society, there are a lot of people demonstrating against the government asking the wearing mask because it's individual freedom. But we know that that's not true. I mean, I think that's not right. I mean, I, as a human rights person, as a member of the Committee on Civil and Political Rights, I know how important individual freedoms are, but equally important is health of people and life of people. And in this kind of pandemic, you have to conceptualization of human rights. Then you have to discuss it. Okay? We cannot say one answer is the right answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor, for your lecture. I have a question regarding your work at the United Nations. As many who are watching right now have a big interest in the United Nations. And you mentioned that prior to your work at the United Nations, that you had a negative view about the organization. And with the COVID-19 situation right now worldwide, a lot of people share this negative view with the global governments and international institutions. So you mentioned that after working there that you changed your mind. So I was wondering what project, experience, or work has changed your opinion about the United Nations?
As I said, I had a very pessimistic view about the UN activities. I majored in international politics and I majored in UN, but for some reason I have not trusted the United Nations because I thought that United Nations was dominated by these few the powerful states, particularly by the United States. So it reflects the interest of the United Nations, United States, and some other friends of United States. So that's why I didn't trust it. But while I was working for the United Nations, I have seen a lot of people there. You know, it's obvious that UN is where the states are competing. States are pursuing their national interest. But on the other hand, there are a lot of experts, independent experts and staffs, okay, who are working for the global issues, global society. Okay. And the independent experts like myself, you know, there are a bunch of independent experts working for the United Nations, and they are truly independent, and they are pursuing the global interest rather than national interest. So I've seen this work is really important. And also over the years, I have seen the growing collaboration between the UN staffs and the experts and NGOs and individuals, even these days private sectors. They are growing collaboration, happening in the United Nations. So I have seen the positive things. So I'm encouraging young people to pay more attention to work of United Nations and maybe thinking about the working for UN. As I said, the future in the hands of yourself. Thank you very much.